In the spotlight, conversation with NATO military high official. Please welcome Deputy Chair of the NATO Military Committee, Lieutenant General Andrew M. ROHLING. It's nice to have you. Now, we have 20 minutes for this one-on-one session in the spotlight, and we will focus on strategies regarding the security of this country and the region, Russian influence, the readiness of Montenegro's armed forces, and of course, cyber defense efforts. Now, we didn't anticipate you having an introductory speech.
No.
But if there is a general message you would like to share with us after being here for the previous part of the program, now is your chance.
No, thank you, Jasmina. Thanks for having me today. No, I mean, I have no long speech, and as you've pointed out, everybody after lunch doesn't want to hear a long speech anyway. Mostly to say thank you for having me today. I think it's part of what I would hope that would be the people walk away knowing that NATO is firmly committed as an organization to Montenegro, which is a key part of it, and that although we've changed our Secretary General here on Tuesday, that really no major change to NATO's overall efforts to promote security across Europe. And as I think most people have seen in the news, Secretary Rutte was in Ukraine yesterday, so his first priority has been to maintain and increase support for Ukraine. He demonstrated that yesterday. His second is to maintain cohesion amongst the alliance, and these efforts like this do that. And then lastly, innovation and moving forward across the board. So I think events like this help us in his three priorities, and it's a good time for that. So thank you again.
So let's start with this. As you mentioned, Russia is in the focus, and given Russia's influence and overt ambitions of Russia and its allies in this part of Europe, how does NATO plan to counter Russian interference in Montenegro and the surrounding region? It's not just Montenegro, especially in the light of recent geopolitical, challenges is a really soft word.
Yeah, no, thanks, Jasmine, for that question. I think we don't have to look at how will we do it in a questionable sense. I think we can show how we have done it.
Okay.
As you know, Russia was behind the August, or last year's, or 2 years ago's cyber attack here in Montenegro, and NATO, together with Montenegro, put a pretty good defense back to counter that. And so I think that's a real example of how NATO is involved in the security of Montenegro on a day-to-day basis, and using those capabilities of all 32 members of the alliance in an area where Russia more and more, and other state and non-state actors, not just Russia, are spreading disinformation and other ways to try to weaken our resolve. And I think NATO as an alliance and Montenegro as a key part of that together provides a more stable and more secure environment collectively.
How does NATO evaluate the situation within the Montenegrin armed forces, considering the lack of consensus among the members of the Council of Defense and Security regarding the dismissal of the current chief of the General Staff?
That's an internal Montenegro issue that I won't really have a comment on, other to say that NATO needs strong leadership, and I hope that we get strong leadership as well.
But how can you assess the current? How would you assess the current state of military readiness of Montenegro's armed forces, given that it's a NATO member?
I would give not necessarily a subjective, but I'd give you a very objective assessment. And as lately, in the last 2 months, we had an element of the Montenegrin forces went and did training in Grafenwehr and Hohenfeld's training area in Germany as a member of a larger U.S. brigade in Operation Sabre Junction. And frankly, by all accounts, they were a phenomenal element to that exercise, and really did. So I think that's a real hands-on display of the capabilities and readiness that the Montenegrin forces have. Montenegro is involved in United Nations mission Iraq, in the Kosovo. They have elements in Bulgaria and Latvia, all of them doing extremely well. And so I think Montenegrin armed forces are an integral part of NATO.
We had earlier in the program a Minister of Defense of Montenegro, and he said that they are steadfast in their fulfilling every obligation from NATO membership. Your view of the situation is?
Very positive.
Course,
yeah, I mean, Montenegro has increased to well over 2%, one of 23 countries of the 32 that have met their 2% spending limit. More than 30% investment in defense articles and in modernization. So I think that Montenegro is on a great path to keeping a capable and ready army.
let's talk about the region a little bit with ethnic tensions in Kosovo and Bosnia and Herzegovina especially. How does NATO perceive the risk of this renewed conflict in the region?
Yeah, first and foremost, NATO is absolutely committed to the Western Balkans. And so while I would say it's secure today, there's some fragility in it based on external actors and to those areas. But NATO 100% committed, and it's committed. And as you can see, we've have a large, or not large, but the same size force there has been there since 1999. The NATO members have committed to that force for the next 2 years as the force sourcing continues. We are deploying, as of Monday, elements of the Allied Rapid Reaction Force, did an exercise into North Macedonia. They'll spend a little over 200 soldiers for the next couple weeks there, training their forces and the ability to deploy, but also providing an extra added show that NATO, again, continues to be committed in there. And then within Bosnia and Herzegovina, NATO continues to support the EU and UN missions there with forces that are there. In fact, their commander's here today. So I think that we have real tangible examples of how NATO continues to be enforced. And then lastly, I'll say General Cavoli, as the Supreme Allied Commander, when he testified at the North Atlantic Council last week, he came in and said, I have 2 priorities. One being Ukraine and second being the Western Balkans. And so from the commander of all of NATO forces, I think when Western Balkans is his focus, I think that we're in good hands.
Now, what really made a little explosion in all of our ears in the Western Balkans was the US intelligence reports that mentioning the possible conflict in the region. Now, earlier in the program, our speakers said, okay, it's just information combined in a document and then it's a report. But when we hear US intelligence stamp on it, then we tend to take it really seriously. So how serious are these informations?
Yeah, I think you're referring to a report that I don't actually, it's not a part of a NATO, I'm a NATO guy today, so I will tell you in my NATO role. I think that the situation in the Balkans area is always a concern. There's always the elements of instability that are there, and hence the reason that NATO is fully committed to it. So whether something will happen tomorrow, I don't know, but what I do know is that NATO is ready for what might come.
What would you, as a NATO guy, would like to see from the Western Balkans, from the Western Balkan countries, what they need to do more? Is it more spending? Is it more political will? Is it for all the countries in the Western Balkans to try to get on board the NATO train, so to speak? What is it that you would want to see?
I think I would like to see open and honest dialogue amongst all members, both members of NATO and non-members of NATO, that work together towards stability. I mean, I think it's very clear that a very stable Western Balkans is an absolute necessity for a stable Europe. And so the investment we make in as you put it, increase military spending, okay, increase commitments to NATO, that's great, but really an open, honest dialogue and commitment to peace and stability is what would be good.
Is there any difference with Montenegro being a member of NATO and other parts of NATO alliance? Is there a difference of a country being in the Western Balkans region as compared to other countries?
Yeah, I think with the importance of the Western Balkans for stability in all of Europe, having more and strong NATO members here are vitally important. It's the ability then for NATO members from the Balkans to be able to work with NATO members from the Baltics and NATO members from the High North, all moving in one direction with a common purpose, with common capabilities, with common standards. So having that here in the Balkans is vitally important.
Is the focus even more now on the region of the Western Balkans with the conflict in Ukraine, conflict with war in Ukraine? And has this focused really the need to pay more attention to defense, to security strategies, and so on?
Yeah, absolutely, because clearly the war in the Ukraine is the immediate threat, but instability in the Western Balkans has been around for some time, and to make sure that we can get to a more stable area is vitally important now. What we can't afford is instability in Ukraine, or a war in Ukraine and instability in the Western Balkans. So there's a significant effort across NATO to make sure that we promote stability.
I will just open the floor to the questions. If you have any, you can freely raise your hand and ask the question. But before you do that, what steps is NATO taking to strengthen? You mentioned already the cyber attacks that were happening, and shown that as an example of what NATO has been, how NATO has been helping Montenegro. But you know, what steps should be taken to strengthen the cyber defense capabilities of its member states as a whole? Because as we heard during the program, this is the future, and the future that is already here in part.
So NATO stood up the NATO Cyber Center of Excellence in Estonia. Estonia is the lead nation. So all member nations have the ability to work together through the Cyber Center of Excellence to counter that. I think if you were in Brussels, you'd start seeing more and more discussions within the NATO Council and the NATO working groups on how to counter hybrid threats that you've been seeing, many of which I think we talked about earlier today, and into the future, and then putting a strategy together that aligns the NATO members to move in a common direction, so it's not 32 individual nations working against a cyber threat or a hybrid threat, but a NATO as a whole. It's a relatively new concept. The hybrid and really cyber, although cyber has been around some time, but Russia is weaponizing it in a way that we haven't seen in some time, and so NATO is taking, I think, real concrete efforts to kind of put together a strategy that then everybody can move in the one direction with. So I think we're moving forward there.
What are maybe we have one question. Can we get a microphone here, please? I would just like to ask you, before we get to the microphone, what are the lessons learned from the last cyber attack here in Montenegro and NATO offering its help? What are the lessons learned? What do we need to work on?
Yeah, I think and I'm an infantry officer by trade, so we're already, turning on my phone is quite the cyber bit of activity for me. But I would say what we learned is that a lot of the weaknesses are correctable by individual nations in their own cyber defense. They've left themselves vulnerable in many ways. And so I think what the attack here and in other areas has taught us collectively is that we have to really look hard at how we've invested in cyber defense. And so if you don't invest in your own internal defenses first, then it's kind of hard to counter an attack from someone else. And so I think that was probably the biggest lesson learned is how do you defend yourself and make yourself not vulnerable? And then compounding on that is the other capabilities, and to include, in individual national capabilities that each nation brings to the forefront.
Opening the floor to the questions, Stephen Erlanger has one.
Hello, it's Stephen Erlanger from the New York Times, sir. Admiral Bauer, a man you know very well, has said that he thinks European industry should turn in part from civilian production to military production, because he sees a threat coming from Russia in the next 6 or 7 years. Seems like, for many Europeans, a rather radical push, but I wondered how you felt about it, whether that should happen. Are people taking the threat to them seriously enough, or if they hit the snooze button? Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much. So first, I would never disagree with my boss in public, so of course he's 100% right. But no, I think the larger point is, does the defense industrial base of all individual countries, both in the United States and in Europe, are they moving in the direction that to face the threat we're seeing today? And there's plenty of evidence that says we're not moving fast enough. There's if you looked at the backlog of some of our most key assets that we need, 155 artillery production, which I think Montenegro has the capability and to move forward in that, and others, which would be great. And across the board in other defense materials, we need to do better. And if that equals nationalization, that's way out of my lane. I'll let Admiral Bauer speak to that one. But I would say that we collectively, members, both NATO and the EU, need to work harder in the production of defense materials and a commitment to do so into the future.
Do you think the money's there? I mean,
the money's there if countries wish to use it.
Yeah, well,
they have to make some real tough decisions.
Mr. Kubilius has this new job as defense commissioner, but he has a budget of 1.6 billion euros for the next 5 years. Is that enough? Is that useful?
I mean, that's a hard one for me to say. I would say each country needs to give the money that it can afford to give in all of its other national priorities to meet its national defense requirements. So.
Thank you so much. We are running late on our program. Thank you so much for joining us here on 2BS Forum. Up next is Adnan, joined by two speakers whose opinion, regional and global, is always interesting to hear. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Once again.